Hello, welcome again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Jade Walle.
And Bob Scarborough has the day off, which is a very convenient thing because it's time for Walle's FAIRtax World, the first of our quarterly meetings. How you doing today, bud?
Good. How about you?
Oh, well, it's not too awfully cold in Florida here. We've had a couple of cold days, but other than that, we're doing okay. I bet you're freezing in Denver, though.
Bob, you don't know the definition of cold. We just had more big, thick snowflakes yesterday, and there's snow everywhere, and I had to shovel the driveway and the front porch area. So I bet in Ocala that doesn't happen very often.
No, I have never seen snow here that I can recall. If we have, it's just been a very light flurry that didn't stick and whatever at all. But as I say, well, this is our quarterly foray into Walle's FAIRtax World, and you have picked a topic for this time around that I think we just can't hammer on it enough. We have talked about it, we've talked about it, and there is still this huge misconception about the fair tax versus the flat tax. What are we going to do today?
Yep. Well, Bob, we're going to talk about what the flat tax is exactly and what it would do, and what, as it turns out, would actually still be the same under a flat tax as compared to our current income tax system, and then slip in how the fair tax would be actually quite different from the flat tax.
Good. Well, as we've noticed that the fair tax, flat tax is often just tossed around in the same sentence by people as esteemed as Newt Gingrich. Did you see this the other day? Newt Gingrich was on, and he was talking with someone on television about Georgia's proposal to replace their state income tax with a consumption tax modeled on the fair tax. And he was all for that. He says that's a great idea. But then in the next breath, he says, and we need a flat tax at the national level. Now, he has to know better. What's going on here?
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is a great conversation to have, very important. Many people have and will continue to interchange the flat tax and the fair tax. And I have a theory as to why this is.
All right.
I remember just like Newt Gingrich, I remember when Ted Cruz was running for the Republican nomination in late 2015 or early 2016, and his platform was bringing in a uniform flat tax at the federal level. Now, he's also said subsequent to that he likes the fair tax. I've heard him say that on an interview before, and that's
he
great to hear. But
he was a co-sponsor at one point.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Well, that's really great to hear. But the flat tax and the fair tax are used too interchangeably. Your example of Newt Gingrich discussing a federal flat tax, and then the Ted Cruz platform 6 years ago, are great highlights of why we need to do a better job of immediately educating people on the important differences between the two proposals.
Okay.
And I've got a last example from a personal level as well. Many years ago, when I first read the two fair tax books in preparation for a presentation at a financial reporting conference I was speaking at, I had one of the fair tax books with me on a Saturday morning. I was a third or fourth grade football game where I was watching my daughters cheer. I know what you're going to say. You're a bad dad trying to entertain yourself with a book outside of the fourth grade football, but I can't deny the charge.
Well, I'll give you a break on that.
Over the PA, I heard a call they needed help in the booth, to help the PA announcer, spot the ball, what yard line is it on, and cue the music on timeout. So I walked up to volunteer my music playlist and ball yard marking skills. And anyway, both gentlemen in the booth with me noticed my fair tax book and commented that, they'd love a flat tax. That would be great. And even then, in my infancy of learning about the fair tax, I quickly explained the difference between the flat and the fair tax, and how the fair tax was a national consumption tax, not another smoothed out version of our income tax called the flat tax. Point is, many people feel in their heart and soul that the IRS and our current income and payroll tax systems are defunct and should be thrown out onto the scrap heap of history, to use one of Bob Paxton's favorite lines.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
So he's got a brilliant author. So these people, they're eager to support an alternative. And when they hear about the flat tax, they immediately like it because, hey, it would certainly be better than what we currently have. Now, most Americans are busy doing what they do, raising their families, working hard, trying to pave a way forward, and don't go into the granularity that we all do here on FAIRtax Power Radio. So we can't get too upset when people might interchange the two systems. And on the contrary, we should actually be happy, because the mention of a flat tax allows us to contrast the two alternatives and highlight the clear superiority of the fair tax. the mention of the flat tax is also a cue to us that whoever we're talking with probably is not a fan of the IRS and the current income tax system. So this is a great starting point, I think.
Yeah, well, I don't know too many people who are fans of the IRS and the current system. So let's take that starting point and see what we can where we can go from here. Now, you set the stage for the fact that the fair tax and the flat tax are two entirely different animals, and yeah, there's a good case to be made for being happy when somebody just uses the two of them together, gives you the opportunity to contrast them. But before we dig into far, let's kind of define exactly what we're going to be talking about. What does this flat tax, and there is a flat tax proposal in Congress, what does it purport to do?
Yeah, the flat tax always comes about as HR 1040. Very clever, right? Michael Burgess from Texas District 26 is the current sponsor of the flat tax. And Bob, guess how many co-sponsors are currently signed on to HR 1040?
Oh, you would ask me that. I ought to know. Let's see. But I have a sneaking suspicion that I've got the image of a goose sitting on a nest coming to my mind right at the moment. Am I close?
You're exactly right. It's a goose egg, or in layman's terms, 0 co-sponsors for HR 1040. We currently have 27 House co-sponsors for the fair tax. In many congressional cycles, it's quite higher than that. Like in 2013, there were 75 House and 8 Senate co-sponsors for the Fair Tax Act. I think this comparison of how many co-sponsors each bill has is a precursor to how we'll ultimately conclude on this flat tax versus the fair tax challenge. But I digress. So, okay, here is the summary description of what HR 1040 entails, just so our listeners know exactly what the flat tax would look like if passed into law.
Okay.
So this is the summary, not the actual text of the law. And Bob, this will be very similar to when you do your congress.gov, when you just read the summary of the bill's description. So HR 1040 authorizes an individual or a person engaged in a business activity to make an irrevocable election to be subject to a flat tax in lieu of the existing income tax provisions of 19% for the first 2 years after an election is made and 17% thereafter. The bill calculates taxable income for individual taxpayers by subtracting a basic standard deduction and an additional standard deduction for each dependent from the total of wages, retirement distributions, and unemployment compensation. Business taxable income is gross active income reduced by certain deductions for the cost of business inputs, wages, and retirement contributions. The bill imposes an employer tax on the value of excludable compensation from provided to employees not engaged in business activity of 19% for the first 2 years after an election is made under this bill and 17% thereafter. This bill also repeals the estate, gift, and generation skipping transfer taxes. A 2/3 vote of the House and Senate is required to increase the flat tax rate proposed by this bill or to reduce the amount of the standard deduction.
That's the summary? Wow, I'm not sure I'd want to get into the fine print on that thing. It does not sound simple and transparent to me. As a matter of fact, it sounds like it's more complicated because it enshrines in law parallel tax systems. You can either keep the current one or do the flat one. That proposal does not get rid of the current income tax, correct?
You're exactly right. And it'll be one of our big talking points today. A flat tax is, you really need to insert one caret in between flat and tax and put the word income there. It's a flat tax on income, a flat income tax. So I do have to say that if you experimented on my brain, erasing all knowledge of and ability to understand the fair tax, and you propose the flat tax, including repealing the estate, death tax, the gift tax, those transfer taxes, along with flattening out the income tax rate to 19% with a standard deduction, I'd say done deal. Sure sounds better than what we have now. I think we all would.
Well, I think anybody would agree that anything is better than what we got now. But something else that jumped out at me in that summary was the word irrevocable. You get to decide between which tax system you want one time, and what may be a good decision now becomes a bad decision 3 years down the road. Am I reading that right?
You are, and I didn't touch on that, but that is a very good point. Your words earlier that you're enshrining two different kind of parallel systems, the current income tax and all 77,000 pages of guidance, and or this new kind of flat income tax. So it's going to be, you think the IRS has a tough time now in going through audits and answering 1 out of 50 people who call in for help. Imagine if there's two systems to manage.
Oh, mercy. Well, I tell you, well, unfortunately, I guess we are burdened with some knowledge that there is a simpler, fairer, more transparent alternative out there, which is the fair tax. So let's see if we can go from there.
So we are burdened with that knowledge. And so now that we know that the flat tax and HR 1040 and what it represents, we can begin our journey of comparing the flat tax and the fair tax.
Okay, well, another thing caught my ear during that summary, the thing about the 2/3 majority required to make changes to it. Now, that sounds like this flat tax is going to be a lot more stable, because I don't think you can get 2/3 of Congress to agree on anything these days.
Bob, good point. You did, in fact, hear that correctly. This is a bit of trickery, however, because the way our
Oh,
Constitution is configured, and we all know this, our U.S. House only needs a majority to pass a bill, just like the Senate, notwithstanding the filibuster and budget reconciliation. What this means is that this 2/3 clause is all for show, because all it would take is for a majority in Congress to change this provision, not 2/3. And voila, we could have the rate changed along with the standard deduction or any other aspect of the flat tax code for that matter, such as new deductions, credits, and exclusions.
and I guess the lobbyists could be putting in all kinds of stuff into the flat tax that they're currently putting into the current income tax. I guess they figure we ain't smart enough to figure it all out. But anyway, let's dig into the actual key differences between the two alternatives, fair tax and flat tax. What are some of the most striking differences in your opinion?
Well, your FAIRtax Power Radio episode 270 with Ron is great on some of the flat tax and fair tax differences. So I encourage everyone to listen to it when you get the chance if you haven't already. But let's touch on some things we might not usually think about
Okay.
here. First, the flat tax keeps hidden embedded taxes that are in our tax code today under in the cost of everything we purchase. Those are alive and kicking with the flat tax. So just to remind, economic studies show that 22% of the cost of every US made good or service we consume is made up of embedded payroll and income taxes. So under the flat tax, these hidden costs of the income tax system, with all US consumers paying those taxes at the register, remains in full force. Under the fair tax, the dark and hidden world of embedded taxes in the cost of everything we buy is finally gone once and for all. The flat tax does nothing to change the horrible reality of embedded taxes, while the fair tax ushers in an era of sunlight and transparency, because when we buy our goods and services, the fair tax we pay will be delineated on the receipt, which is actually stipulated in the Fair Tax Act itself. Transparency.
Oh, now that does sound like a good idea. So what we're saying is that the flat tax is still a tax on income, so that all of the embedded taxes that are currently in the prices of everything we've got remain there. And I don't know about you, I don't like that much. I don't like being taxed in a stealthy manner. You pay, $1.98 for a tube of toothpaste, and you don't realize how much of that is the tax. I do understand that when I buy something, I am paying for the cost of the labor and materials that went into making it and the transportation to get it to me. But you just don't even think about the all the embedded taxes, the tax liability, and the compliance costs that are just rolled right into the price of everything. That's insane. Okay, so move on. What's another striking distance in your opinion?
Well, if we build on this concept of our American-made goods costing 22% more than they should, it is often overlooked how the flat tax would continue to favor imported goods while continuing to punish our U.S. exports. If you like hearing how our U.S. trade deficit continues to grow, then you might be a flat tax fan. If, however, if you'd like to see our U.S. goods become more competitive internationally, bringing more sales receipts and income into our U.S. businesses, cities, factories, and employee headcounts, the fair tax might be your cup of tea. So remember, with our income tax, whether flat or not, our U.S. embedded income and payroll taxes represent around 22% of the cost of every domestic product we consume in the U.S. When we import goods from China or Europe, their taxes are not embedded in the cost of these items, which makes them more competitive relative to our overinflated U.S.-made goods, with our 22% embedded taxes included in the buildup of their cost and ultimate selling price. The fair tax encourages exports and makes American-made goods competitive on the world stage because those 22% of embedded income and payroll taxes are eliminated from their cost buildup. Finally, our American-made goods can compete globally on an even playing field. And I always say, if the game is fair and we're not playing with one arm tied behind our back, I'll put our U.S. businesses up against anyone in the world.
Mercy. Well, that sounds like a point that our politicians might really appreciate if they wanted to dig into it like we're doing here today. What other overlooked differences might there be?
Well, one thing we always hear when explaining the fair tax is how it is a sales tax and therefore by definition must be regressive. Of course, we quickly dispel that untruth by outlining how the prebate ensures that all fair tax paid on the basic necessities of life are refunded to every legal U.S. household monthly. And when you crunch the numbers, the prebate actually makes the fair tax more progressive. That means a little more painful to the rich than our current income and payroll tax system. So with the flat tax, the question is, what about regressivity? Here is a key point. The flat tax does not eliminate the payroll tax like the fair tax does. Every worker would still pay the government nearly 10% of their earnings, even if they're in the ranks of the working poor, before attending to their family's basic needs. Given this, even with the flat tax uniform rate and standard deduction, when coupled with the payroll tax, the flat tax and payroll tax system is significantly more aggressive and hurtful to the poor when compared to the fair tax. The only way to even begin to try and make the flat tax more fair and less regressive would be to usher in the exceptions. That's the cue for the lobbyists to start filling in if you missed it. Of course, no matter how many credits, exemptions, deductions, or loopholes we add to the flat tax, the payroll tax is still there, making up 40% of our Treasury's receipts and keeping the flat tax on the regressive side of the field. And also, I'd point out here that the math behind this is not overly complex. There are many ambiguities in life and mysteries and complexities of the heart and mind, but let me be clear, this is not one of them. The fair tax is by far the most progressive and fairer to the working poor than the current income tax or the flat tax system, period.
Well, you make your living crunching numbers, so I assume you pretty well know what you're talking about here. So if I'm understanding you right, the flat tax really doesn't do anything for the working poor at all. It's basically the same as the income tax, gives them the exact same thing that they're dealing now with, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And there's actually some great schedules on fairtax.org that show out how the income tax, even though it's a graduated rate, and this is what confuses people. It's like, well, how could that be regressive? It has a graduated rate, the payroll tax. And when you compare these two, there's some great schedules in fairtax.org in the research tab that kind of show you how the fair tax is actually more progressive, less regressive, and therefore fairer to the working poor and really everyone in the U.S.
All right. Well, what other differences come to mind?
Okay. We can never avoid the conversation of evasion. It's so rampant. So let's think about this problem. The IRS commissioner admitted this past year that the annual illegal tax evasion has reached $1 trillion. That's annually, which is in line with the study that the Americans for Fair Taxation had commissioned a few years ago. Let's think about whether our human tendency to cheat the income tax and our motivations change at all with the flat tax. Since the flat tax remains an income tax, everyone is still motivated to cheat because no man or woman feels right when the very work of their hands is taken from them in the form of income taxes. I loved what Mr. Etwap said on your interview a few weeks ago in episode 296. He's the immigrant from Uganda running for Congress.
Out there in Texas,
Yeah, he said that we should not be taxed when we go to work, when we drive to work, make investments, but rather when he decides to buy something. Basically, when our income is taxed, the natural human feeling is that a little bit of the very essence of who we are is taken. The very essence of our ability to create wealth and make or buy any property we might have fortune to acquire is stripped away. This psychologically leads to a human tendency to justify and rationalize why it's all right to evade the income tax anytime you can. We, of course, don't encourage or promote evasion of any kind, but it is easy to see when we examine how the human mind works, why we are at 1 trillion with a T evasion, illegal evasion every single year in the US. This phenomenon doesn't go away with the flat tax. Pure and simple. All these same feelings remain with a flat tax on your most sacred property, which is our income. However, the psychological cycle recedes away with the fair tax, where studies show that illegal evasion will decrease by 95% under the fair tax relative to the income tax.
Wow.
Let that sink in for a minute. Bob, if you grab your calculator real quick, I think you'd tell me that 95% of 1 trillion is about an extra 950 billion that the fair tax would bring into the U.S. Treasury each year. All we have to do is pass the fair tax.
Wow, I tell you what, good point there on evasion. As a matter of fact, it's interesting that after the years and years of just downplaying the size of the evasion problem at all, they finally admitted the real scope of it. And then the Biden administration's response is, well, let's triple the size of the IRS. Let's hire a whole new army of auditors and agents, and let's implement an unprecedented level of snooping in people's bank accounts in order to fight all this evasion stuff. And it seems to me that I'm trying not to be partisan here because fair tax is not a partisan issue, but it seems like the Republican Party is missing a golden opportunity to offer up the fair tax as a more effective, less intrusive way to deal with evasion. And if I can catch up with Kat Kamek at CPAC in about a month, I'm going to ask her about that.
Oh, you bring up great points. And Steve Hayes, the president of Americans for Fair Taxation, had a great article in his chairman's report in the last couple months about how, as this evasion continues to increase, it's actually a sign. It's pointing to the fact that Americans are fed up with, not content with the current system, and it's a form of soft revolution almost, if you will. And his article was brilliant on this. Mm-hmm. And so you just continue to see this evasion increase at exponential rates. The gig economy doesn't help anything, of course, because it's not like 1968, where 99.8% of people get a W-2 and work 8 hours a day at the factory. It's just a different world we're in. So naturally, evasion is increasing, and people don't like the income tax, and they continue to evade it at an exponential rate. And I agree. I think Republican, Democrat, because again, we're nonpartisan, this is a golden opportunity to give people something that they would love.
Okay, well, even if we concede the point maybe a bit that the flat tax will bring down evasion to some degree, that wouldn't even come close to the 95% reduction that the fair tax would bring us. Let me move on to something that we actually talked about last week on FAIRtax Power Radio when we were going through the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And this is one of the points in the Taxpayer's Bill of Rights, is the taxpayer has the right to privacy. Constitution guarantees that we're a country where citizens can feel secure in their property, possessions, papers in effect, and somehow the IRS doesn't get that memo.
Yeah, they sure did, and it's a great question. Under the flat tax, we are still reporting income to the IRS. This is a key point. There will still be individual audits by the IRS. We will still be compelled to hand over our most sacred and personal information about our income, investments, and other interests. Basically, the privacy that has been stripped away from U.S. taxpayers stays stripped away under the flat tax. The fair tax, on the other hand, only needs the few businesses that are actually end consumer retailers to collect and remit the fair tax they collect from customers. We as individuals have no more tax returns, no more sharing of our most intimate data with the IRS or tax courts, and complete freedom to keep our entire paycheck and income, since we'll only be taxed when we spend at the retail register. Privacy.
Yeah, and we are no longer subject to being hacked and having all of our private data put out on the internet. Like, I don't think anybody has ever, no heads have rolled over the ProPublica leak, if I'm mistaken. So the right of privacy, I think, exists more on paper than it does in the reality. Let's move on here. What about compliance costs? You mentioned in the past that individuals and businesses spend almost 9 billion hours a year, $600 billion annually, just to comply, or shall I say, to try to comply with the U.S. tax code. And how would that change under the flat tax, or would it?
Great question on compliance costs. Real quick, let me pivot back to your privacy. Something I was thinking about, and as you mentioned, in golf, Ron Malera used to play golf. He would be familiar with this phrase that when you play golf, you take the hazard out of play. Like sometimes if the water, the little lake is in the way between you and the green, maybe you don't go right over the lake. You take the hazard out of play.
Oh, the hazards find my ball every time. Of course, I don't play all that much, but go ahead.
Me too. Well, everything you just said, with our current system, all the information on the IRS's websites that are very hackable, There's myriad attempts to hack that database every day, all the leaks of personal information. Yeah, so with the FAIRtax, none of that information is out there, so it can't be hacked. You just pay tax at the retail register. So sorry, just wanted to get that in and get back to your question on compliance costs.
Okay, go ahead.
Compliance costs with the flat tax would be somewhat reduced with, I've actually seen estimates in some of our research that maybe estimates of 50% of compliance costs would be reduced when you flatten out the tax code with a flat tax. But we'll all continue to be responsible for income tax returns, tax reform instructions, and businesses must still track income. And oh, by the way, the flat tax won't stay flat very long. We'll touch on that in a second.
And there will still be people using the old system if they made that choice.
That's right. That's right. You'll have both. So you still have compliance costs. Maybe they're reduced a little bit, and 50% is quite a bit. That estimate, heck, that's great. I think we talked about 600 billion annually. If we can cut that in half, that's great. But let's compare it to the FAIRtax. The FAIRtax reduces current compliant costs by over 90%. I think it's probably closer to 95 or 98% each year. So 50% great, 90% much, much better. So in fairness to the flat tax, as it is written now, prior to it being lobbied and Frankensteined over the next several years, it is helpful. It is helpful in reducing some of our excessive and wasteful compliance costs and time. However, imagine over 90% of that cost and time gone with the FAIRtax. What an amazing shot in the arm to the American business and households. Imagine what great inventions and cures would come about with this time. Some of us would waste the gift of time back in our lives, no doubt, but many Americans would blaze great new trails with it, I'm sure.
Oh, I got to give you props here. You're the first person I've ever known that uses Frankenstein as a verb. So that was really, that's a good description of what happens to a bill in Congress, though. Let me shift gears here a little bit. We hear a lot, especially the past 12 months, how people are now just flooding across the southern border, coming into the United States illegally, and they're not being returned to their home countries. Now, the current system has always struggled with collecting income and payroll taxes from people who are in the country illegally. What does the flat tax do for that, if anything?
A wonderful question. It's certainly an issue du jour, if you will. Under the flat tax, people illegally living in the U.S. would still not be paying the now flat income tax and would still be avoiding payroll taxes when they work for companies off the books. None of this changes with the flat tax. This is an ever-increasing component of our overall U.S. population, meaning that more and more of the people living in the U.S. are not paying their federal tax burden. Under the FAIRtax, everyone who is living in the U.S., no matter how they got here and whether or not they're on the record, so to speak, would pay their full federal tax burden. How, you might ask? Well, currently, everyone doesn't have to fill out a federal income tax return. Every employer doesn't have to charge and collect the payroll tax on their undocumented workers. However, everyone must eat, buy clothes, work, transport themselves from place to place, and generally consume to live. This means that the underground economy, think gangs, criminal organizations, prostitutes, as well as anyone here illegally, will finally pay their full U.S. tax obligation, their fair share, so to speak, with the FAIRtax. Under the flat tax, they continue to illegally evade our U.S. income and payroll tax system, helping our annual illegal tax evasion grow to $1 trillion, which is obviously unsustainable for the long term. Also, an elegant FAIRtax benefit is that to receive the prebate, one must be a legal U.S. resident, meaning illegal residents are actually paying a much higher effective tax rate relative to U.S. citizens. This will have the natural effect of encouraging increased levels of legal U.S. immigration, given the thirst for the very valuable prebate. Also, the projected economic explosion unleashed by the FAIRtax that we've talked about in the past will require massive amounts of qualified legal immigrants, which will all work for our nation's betterment.
Good. You touched on something Jim Bennett talked about in the Grassroots Corner a while back. He was dealing with the argument that it's not fair that the FAIRtax should not be taxing, food and clothing and rent and basic necessities like that because it hurts the poor. His point was, and it's a very good one, hey, you have to do that if you're going to tax the underground economy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I love Jim's grassroots article. I read that. He brought up some points that I hadn't even thought about before. It's a wonderful, wonderful article. And also I'd add on to that, what are the fair tax principles? Simple, fair, efficient, transparent.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to keep this fair and simple and not let it be Frankensteined, like to use the new verb, we've
Uh-huh.
got to keep it fair and simple. Everything is taxed, but you get the prebate to untax you for your basic
Yes.
necessities of life. And you touched on this with Bob Scarborough a few weeks ago. Then everyone gets to decide what their basic necessities are, whether it's a six
Mm-hmm.
pack of beer, baby formula, diapers, milk, food, steak, or spam. You get to decide because you get the prebate and you're untaxed on your expenditures up to the poverty level, the basic necessities of life. It's
Yeah.
fair and simple this way.
Yeah. So your basic necessities are taxed at the cash register. You get it back in the prebate. They are not taxed out of your own pockets. So that works good. Okay, let's move on. There's another aspect I'd like you to touch on because I feel things building up to a grand crescendo here, the final act, if you will. We could go on with these differentials between the fair tax and the flat tax for a while, but what is the one culminating reason in your CPA mind that the flat tax is not even close to being as effective, simple, and fair as the fair tax?
Sure. No, good question. And I think you felt the build up appropriately. So first, our tax system should not tax work, savings, and investment. The flat tax would still do this. Second, we'd still have the IRS with the flat tax. Third, and this often gets overlooked, but we would still need the 16th Amendment to remain in place for the flat tax to be legal. That's
Mm-hmm.
huge. We have all railed against this horrible year of 1913 and the outlandish decision it was to allow an income tax in the first place, but yet we're considering an alternative tax system that doesn't require the 16th Amendment's repeal. This should be a clue to us all that the flat tax is basically, at its core, the same thing we have now, just smoothed out for the moment. In 1913, the income tax began as what people would now call a flat tax. In fact, the current flat tax proposal that we read earlier is arguably much more complex than the first income tax system ushered in 109 years ago. The point is, a flat tax does not stay flat. Ron Malero used to call the flat tax the lobbyist permanent employment act of whatever year you were in. And it's true.
Yeah, you
And when
nail
we
that one.
yeah, when we look back to 1913, only 1/2 of 1% of Americans paid any income tax. That wouldn't be that way with a flat tax. So in 1913, this is how simple it was. A 1% tax was paid on those making over around $300,000 or so in today's dollars. And a 7% tax rate kicked in for those making over around 6 million in today's dollars. That was it. I'd say the flat tax with the deductions, the payroll tax remaining intact, and how virtually all Americans would have to deal with the tax and any changes to it in future cycles is much more complex than the day one 1913 income tax that only affected 1/2 of 1% of us. So the crescendo here, to answer your point, is that if the 1913 income tax was much simpler than the current HR 1040 flat tax proposal, how did the 1913 income tax morph into the current monstrosity that it is? Let that question sink in. Well, obviously, it did for multiple reasons, and if it happened before, it will happen again. Bob and Ron, you and Ron, always asked on FAIRtax Power Radio, rhetorically, I might add, how long do you think it will stay flat? That's the crescendo. Our lobbyists have
Not
only gotten
very.
more, yeah, not very at all. And think from 1913 to now, our lobbyists have only gotten increasingly and exponentially more adept at working over the tax code each congressional cycle. And as you point out each episode on your congress.gov search, you point out all the thousands of proposals to change the code. So in my humble opinion, we'd be back to what we have now or worse within 2 to 3 presidential administrations if a flat tax were ever signed into law. So much for fairer and simpler system with the flat tax. So again, while I appreciate that the flat tax proposal is much better than what we have right now, and I'd take it in a heartbeat, there is something so much better at our disposal. Drum roll, please. The fair tax.
Indeed. And remember, we're still talking about HR 1040 maintains two separate parallel systems. The current one, and then as the flat tax morphs into something more like the current one, then the IRS will have two incredibly complex systems to deal with. Oh,
and then the rate changes after 2 years, of course, just to add some complexity.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I tell you what, I think we've covered this pretty well today, and I would imagine that we're probably going to have to come back to it at some point in the future because people have never quite understood fair tax, flat tax. They think they're first cousins and interchangeable. They're really not. We will continue to hammer away on the differences on FAIRtax Power Radio, and I'm sure you and the AFFT board are going to be doing a lot of educational work along this same line. But we certainly do appreciate your CPA insight, and I know you're a pretty good ardent student of taxation systems and the consequences thereof as well. So do appreciate you loaning us your expertise.
Absolutely. Great. Bob, I always love talking with you. It's fun, and we have to think about a topic for next quarter.
All right. Well, if anybody has any ideas that if you want to ask a CPA a really tough question, send in your possible ideas that you'd like to see Jade handle about 3 months from now to the fairtaxguys@gmail.com, and we'll see if we get any input and we can put you to work in about 3 months.
That sounds great.
All right. Well, again, thanks for talking to us, and we'll catch you later. And it's always great having Jade Walle with us here on FAIRtax Power Radio. Look forward to the next Walle's FAIRtax World coming up in about 3 months. And again, if you have any topics you'd like to see him discuss, send them to us at the fairtaxguys@gmail.com. And who knows, he may be tackling your subject next here. But until then, please remember what the FAIRtax guys always say. The fair tax is the only truly fair tax. And once you understand it, you'll demand it.
The FAIRtax is a tax replacement plan where we take all the federal income taxes, including corporate, personal, gift, and estate taxes, and replace them with one national consumption tax on new purchases, above the poverty level only. This form of consumption tax comes with no exceptions and is progressive, not regressive. The poor are not paying more, and the rich are not paying less. What makes it progressive is that all Americans are untaxed up to the poverty level via the prebate, much like your standard tax deduction. The taxes are collected by retail businesses at state level, so the system is more accountable. The IRS is done away with, and you have control over your money and what the overall tax rate your household pays. The fair tax is revenue neutral, so the government receives the same amount of money as they do now, and it's fair because you decide what's fair, not them. To learn more, visit fairtax.org and be sure to like us on social media to help educate your friends and spread the word.